So that's always the case, right? There was a point in time when we programmed without having an internet connection.
What?
Yes, I know, believe it or not. Somebody had to program all the stuff that made the internet go. And when we were programming the stuff that made the internet go, we didn't have the internet to use at the time.
This is Philosophy Programs and Prompts, a podcast where two real humans can't stop talking about how much other people use AI. I'm Casey Hart.
I'm Carl Brown.
And we are excited to continue. It's almost like a series now. We did an emergency episode on Hank Green. But there's like this epidemic. I don't know what I want to call it. There's definitely a trend of people using AI and getting called out for it, and there being a backlash, right? We saw it with Hank Green. There's another space. I'm not familiar. Like, are you familiar with the fitness YouTube culture at all, Carl?
A little, probably not the way you are. I don't do normal kinds of weights. So my fitness stuff is more esoteric than what you seem to be doing.
That has a potential to derail this whole episode because I want to follow up. We'll save that for another one. But Mike Israetel, I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
He is the head of, or the face of, Renaissance Periodization, huge YouTube channel, and he is many things. There's a lot of drama here. By the way, if folks want us to like talk about Israetel's book and stuff like that, drop it below in the comments. That's an episode I would be happy to do if there's the interest for it. But the short version of it is he's very full of himself, thinks he's better at everything than every other person if he just had a little bit of time, including artificial intelligence and futurism, thinks he might become immortal soon.
Oh,
if this
boy.
sounds hyperbolic, that he will say those things. Entertaining guy, like some natural talent on the camera, but he got called to task for some of his bodybuilding performances. Then he got called to task for his dissertation being dubious quality, I will say. And recently he released a book that's been called out as being AI slop. And so that's a big controversy over in the fitness culture.
I'm assuming he's had it for long enough that his dissertation couldn't have been AI slop?
That could not have been. That was in 2013 that came out. Yeah, different issues with the dissertation. Not M dashes. It was more lack of grammar and contribution and use of the sources. But in this present book, now there's, backlash to people saying, why are you using so much AI in this? And he's trying to defend it and back and forth. But I imagine this is happening in a bunch of different, I only know a couple of these niches.
I just had this horrifying thought. Oh man, that's terrifying. I had not thought at all about the number of dissertations that are going to end up being AI slop now.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Ooh, okay. That might be a different episode. That's terrifying. Okay. Sorry. Put that out of my mind.
But what I want to talk about today is I don't know whether I'll say a positive spin on that necessarily, but these other examples are sort of like backlash to people who are using AI too much. And something that came up in both of our YouTube feeds recently from the algorithm was a video from a guy named Brett Codes. I don't know his last name. Maybe his last name's Codes. And Mr. Codes gave I thought like a really genuine and endearing sort of like, face to the camera testimonial for why he is going to stop using AI, will not be using AI as a coder anymore. And when I watched this video, I felt it was at least compelling on a first pass. That was like, man, maybe I'm, should I be rejecting all uses of AI? Like, how do I feel about this? And so I texted you.
Right.
I think we're actually officially friends now, not just
podcasters. I'm okay with that.
Well, okay with it. I'll take it. And we'll see if by episode 20, if you like heartily endorse the friendship title. But I didn't know what I expected you to say, but I thought you were going to be like, yeah, I think there's something right there. But when I texted you, you had a different take?
Yeah, I understand where he's coming from. And there are some things that I can understand that he said, but I think he's making a couple of category errors. We'll talk about it, but there's a difference between AI, the concept, and AI, the way that current AI companies are using things. And I think in some ways he's saying, I don't like the way OpenAI is doing X, and so therefore I'm not going to use AI at all, when those two things, as much as OpenAI would like us to believe, are not the same.
Yeah.
And there's a way in which the way that he's talking about AI in coding is the same way that I saw people talking about Stack Overflow in coding, and the same way I saw people talking about using package managers in coding many years ago. And both of those arguments have gone away. And I expect that this argument will also go away at some point. And so I wanted to kind of give a historical perspective on that kind of backlash and how that has happened over the last couple of decades.
Awesome. So one thing, and I think we could hear it in your tone of voice there. This is pulling back the curtain a little bit for folks out there. But Carl was a little hesitant to do a video. He didn't want to look like he was punching down at Brett's channel, because he's like, oh, he only has, 6,000 subscribers or something like that. Which, first of all, I will say, as someone who has about 6,000 subscribers to my own YouTube channel, I felt a little bit attacked. Second of all, now Brett has like 9,000 subs, and this video has like 500,000 views. Which means that even if Carl is punching down, I would be punching up if there were any punching at all. But the point is, no punching. I thought that Brett's video was a clear way for him to lay out his views on why he wants to stop coding. And that gives us a really nice sort of target and strategy for us to discuss those reasons, kind of work through them, and think about more generally what kinds of reasons should go into evaluating your use of a technology in your job or life in general.
I found him to be very sincere. I found what he talked about to be well-reasoned from the perspective that he has, which is slightly different than the one that I have, and we'll get into that, I'm sure. But I have no animus toward him. I don't think that he shouldn't have put the video out, or any, I don't think he should get canceled or anything like that. I just have a slightly different perspective, so thought we would be worth talking about that in an episode.
Beautiful. All right. And to the contrary, go take a look at his video. We'll link it below in the description. Not only do we not want him canceled or people to be negative towards him, go watch him and support him. We're grateful that he made the video, because it helped me think about a lot of these things, and we're going to process through roughly his argument structure. We'll meander as we go, as we normally have a conversation. But so here's the case that Brett is making for why he's no longer going to use AI. This is very oversimplified, and then we'll break down sort of point by point into some of the reasons that he gives. So I list it as roughly 4 aspects to his case. First, that AI and LLMs in particular, right, cause harms. They're bad for the planet, those sorts of things. And so that makes AI use negative out of the gate to some degree. Secondly, AI makes Brett and other coders worse at their jobs. So it's harming their professional ability to be coders. Third, it makes the business worse off. It hurts the code base itself. Even if they were worse coders, but the code base was better, maybe you could argue you should still use it. But he says, no, the code base is worse too. And then lastly, has sort of existential responses to using AI. He thinks that it's eliminating something important about why he does the job. It's not fun anymore. And I don't mean that in just superficial, we always should just be able to have fun at our job. But there's something sad and soulless and defeating about having AI as part of our workflow. Does that feel right as the general high level?
Yeah, and I've seen other people, that last one is interesting. I've seen some other people have videos talking about how the things that they used to enjoy about programming are things that AI is taking away from them. So we'll talk about that. But that's kind of an interesting idea that has weird implication.
All right. So let's look at the first one then, which is that AI causes real harms in the world. And the first thing that he goes to that I think anchors how serious it is to him, especially personally, is that he had something. Now, I'm not psychologist or psychiatrist or anything. I don't want to over personalize it or diagnose him. But he says in using the AI, he was experiencing what he thought were some medical symptoms one night, late at night. he consulted the AI and it said, you should go to the emergency department. And he went there and eventually they're like, you should go home and rest. Why did you even come in? And he was kind of embarrassed about this. But that was a flashpoint for him to realize that, oh, wait, I'm kind of in too deep. This thing is affecting my connection with reality and the real world.
Yeah, it's a couple things on that. So first off, I'm actually not upset about the idea of an AI being a little too ready to tell someone to go seek medical help, because I know that there have been instances where AIs have, or allegedly, at least according to lawsuits and court documents that I've read, where AIs have encouraged people, especially people having mental health issues, not to seek medical advice, which I think is far, far, far worse than sending someone to the doctor when they don't actually need to go to the doctor. So I'm not really upset about that. For me, this is more about like telling people not to Google their symptoms, right? And
Say more about that.
If you talk to people in the medical field, right, there are a lot of people who will Google what they're feeling. They will self-diagnose themselves. A lot of times they will self-diagnose themselves incorrectly. They'll show up at the doctor saying, okay, I have this weird thing. And the doctor's like, no, you're dehydrated. Drink a glass of water and go home, or something to that effect. There have been cases where, for really obscure things, that people have managed to find something that matches their symptoms. Usually, from what I've seen, that's when the medical professionals that they're dealing with either are too harried or too busy, are not really paying attention, are not really caring, really want to just kind of give them the most simple possible diagnosis and then get them to go away. I don't really blame the doctors for that. I blame the US medical system for that, which is really putting a lot of pressures on doctors to try to see more patients in any given unit of time, but that's a whole different conversation. But I think in general, when people without some kind of professional judgment use Google or AI to try to make things like medical diagnoses and other things, if you ask an AI to design a building that's going to be under a lot of load and have a lot of people walking around in it, or to design a bridge that's going to have cars running over it or something like that, that's probably not a good idea, because there are things that we have professionals that know what is likely to go wrong and what to do about it. And so I think that, here are my symptoms. Should I go to the doctor or not, or whatever, it's not a good thing to have a conversation with AI about, but I don't think that's a problem inherently with AI. Now, there have been cases that I've seen where, certain AI CEOs have talked about the medical uses of their AI technology and using ChatGPT or Claude or whichever as a medical screener. And that's a whole different conversation. And I'm very unhappy with that. But the idea of someone just using AI to tell them what they probably have is probably not a good idea from a accuracy standpoint.
Yeah, we have to be clear here on what is this argument toward. And if the argument is I should not be using AI anymore for my job, right? Then something about AI convincing me, or however you want to describe the scenario, but at midnight or whatever, 2 a.m, I'm experiencing symptoms. I talk to an AI and it sends me to the emergency department. That is just orthogonal to using AI at work, right? In lots of ways.
In lots of ways. I mean, there's an argument to say, if the AI is going to send me to the emergency room unnecessarily, then if I'm using the AI to design the architecture for code that's going to do like self-driving or something like that the AI might make the same kind of error and end up causing some problems. And so, if the kinds of coding that you're doing has life or death consequences or medical consequences or that kind of thing, then yes, you probably shouldn't be using AI for that. But I don't know that it's the case, or I would argue it's not the case that means you should blanket never use AI for coding, full stop.
Yeah. one thing I do want to throw out here that I think is really good, like I am glad whenever people are willing to talk about their mental health issues in public. Like his ability to feel comfortable saying this in the video, I think is really laudable and important. When I think about this case here, I think about in my past there were periods of times when I had panic attacks, and goodness knows what would have happened if I were engaging in conversations with an LLM at those times. Like maybe that would have been better or worse. I don't know that counterfactual, but it did have me thinking more about what's the right approach here. But as you mentioned, even if there are lots of ways we could try and design the LLMs to do the right things in these sorts of situations. One would just be don't answer any medical questions. One would be err on the side of caution. Like there's a lot of cases that can be made about what's the right design for AI in these sorts of cases. But I don't think this to me is decisive against using it at work. I will say there might be some portion of the population, substantially small enough or whatever, who are incapable of using LLMs just a little bit. Maybe this is sort of like equivalent to, and again, this is not Brett in particular. Right. I don't know enough about him to say whether this is him or not. Yeah, there are alcoholics who just can't have any alcohol in the house. It's not going to work. Maybe there are some people who are incapable of having conversations with LLMs without doing things that will lead them, into very like unhealthy places. That's a possibility. I don't know what portion that is, but I don't think we can regulate our entire industry or like work usage of it based on those sorts of cases either.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we still don't understand about what the psychological impact of this thing is going to be. We know there's a thing called the ELIZA effect that's been around since the 60s. I've talked about that on other videos where somebody made a very simple mix and match regular expression moving strings around program called ELIZA that you can actually run in Emacs now, among other places. And it really caused people certain people at least, to start confiding in the thing like it was a therapist or something. And it really alarmed the guy that wrote ELIZA. And he spent most of the rest, or a lot of the rest of his career, trying to convince people that chatting with an AI is not a good idea. Or chatting with a computer, I guess, is not a good idea. They weren't. ELIZA is very much not an AI in any stretch of the imagination, although it might seem like that under some circumstances. So I'll put some stuff about the ELIZA effect in the show notes, but we know that there are some psychological implications of interacting with computers that are programmed to act like they're having conversations, and the new large language models do that to a very, very extreme degree compared to anything we've had before. And so I know that there are people that are studying it, but we really don't understand what the implication of that on humanity is going to be. So stay tuned for that, I guess.
Yeah. Worth paying attention to. Okay, I think that's the heaviest of the AI harms. Not to say that the others aren't potentially really important, maybe even more important, but at least heaviest topic for a podcast. The other ones are water usage and energy usage. That if we think that LLMs, AI in general, are trained up, both the training of the models and then also the execution of any given command or set of tokens is just environmentally unfriendly. What do you feel about that?
So I see this pop up a lot, and this is, in my opinion, this is conflating AI inherently, or the current large language models that we're using inherently, with the way that some of the AI companies are behaving, right? If you build a data center in Arizona, right, where it's constant drought conditions and the amount of water is limited, and then you use a bunch of water to cool your data center, that's obviously bad, right? That's obviously irresponsible. But that doesn't mean that every AI is running in a drought location, right? And there are places on the planet that get plenty of freaking water. And if the data center is there, then water use is not a problem. And so in my mind, the problem about AI using too much water is not about data centers in general or AI in general. It's about the way that specific companies are building data centers in areas that are drought stricken, largely because that means the land is cheaper. And their greed is not necessarily a reflection directly on the idea of AI usage. Now, if you want to say, I know where this particular company is running their particular data centers, and I know that those particular data centers are running in drought-stricken areas, and therefore I'm going to use this other company's AI instead, that makes perfect sense to me. But the idea of saying, I'm not going to use AI at all because some data centers are built in drought-stricken areas seems weird to me. The energy usage argument is similar, but not quite as strong, because the question is, where's the energy coming from, right? If you've got a data center that's out in the middle of nowhere and it's surrounded by solar panels, then that's a different kind of thing, right? This is all presuming that we're not going to have a silly argument about whether or not climate change is man-made or something. On the other hand, unlike water, electricity is very fungible, right? For the most part,
ship it around the grid.
Yeah, for the most part, most of the grids are interconnected. And so if you've got a bunch of solar panels over here that are connected to a data center, well, if those solar panels were connected directly to the grid and there was no data center, then that means that there's a lot of fossil fuels that are on the grid that wouldn't need to be on the grid.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, the fact that there are places on this planet that don't have responsible power generation, when they're capable in many places of having far more climate-friendly power generation, is not inherently a reflection on AI, and your choice not to use AI is not going to help that. If that's a thing that is important to you, and I understand why, if it would be important to you, then your personal use or not use of AI is not even a drop in the bucket compared to what's actually going on in terms of that space, and your voice is much more likely to be useful pushing for systemic reforms and engaging with your elected officials and that kind of thing than it is to just personally trying to abstain the tiny fraction of power and water that you're personally might be using compared to the total amount that's out there. Because even if everybody listening to this stopped all of their AI usage, all of the water and electricity that would be saved wouldn't be a rounding error.
Yeah, this feels somewhat analogous to me for people who would abstain from eating meat on the ethical grounds that factory farming is animal torture, which I think is a very compelling argument. Mm-hmm. Precisely because they would say, in both respects for what you're saying here, on the one hand, my eating or not eating a chicken burger, even if that was, not well-sourced, not cruelty-free chicken, is not going to cause at all a change in the overall, U.S. consumption of factory farm chicken. And also, it doesn't speak to opposing eating meat on those grounds isn't a reason that you can't eat any meat, right? Because you can maintain that, if I hunt for the animals myself, right, or ethically source them or whatever, that is fine. So you can say something like that here. I think I'm going to be a little bit different than you insofar as even in the, in the factory farming sort of case, I'm going to say whether my having this chicken burger or not makes a difference in the total consumption, right, an appreciable difference, I would still think it's unethical. And I would lean exactly that way here too. Yes, let's just take for a given that ChatGPT is unethically using energy. Let's just suppose that's true. Okay. Then if I think that is so, then my using that model or that service, I think somehow ties me into the badness. I don't think that makes me as culpable as the company itself or something, but I think that is enough of a reason for me to not use it.
So if you choose not to consume meat that's been factory farmed or consume meat at all, then over the course of a number of years, there are going to be a certain number of animals that are not going to end up being killed and fed to you. And
I don't know whether that's so. I think those probably, if I just stopped eating, like if everything else in the world went basically as it is, and I stopped eating chicken, say, I think the same number of chickens would be slaughtered. I think there'd probably just be a little more wasted chicken, however much chicken I would have consumed on a given year. That's my.
But the harm given to the individual chicken, right, in my mind, doesn't map to a certain number of tons of CO2 released into the atmosphere, because the chicken hurts, right? The CO2 doesn't, right? There's no like individual being that has feelings or could arguably have feelings or could arguably hurt specifically by that amount of CO2, right? That's a completely fungible global problem. It doesn't matter where the CO2 comes from. It's still going to cause some tiny amount of temperature rise. Those are not problems. That amount of CO2 released or methane released or whatever is not, full stop, not going to be solved by even a large number of individuals deciding to abstain from AI use. If that's the thing you're trying to solve, you're not going to be reducing any suffering by removing AI from your personal mix of technologies that you use. And I would argue that there's at least a chance that that would not be the case in the factory farm or the meat instance. There are, over the course of your life, there are likely to be at least a few animals that might be spared if you never ate another piece of meat in your entire life. That's not going to be the case in the CO2 case, in my mind.
I see. I guess I'm not sure that I'm convinced of that, but I think that makes clear where the divergence would be. The other place there can be a divergence here, and those of you listening, like, how do you evaluate the goodness or badness of an action? If you're more of a consequentialist, they're like, it's the harm done that determines the goodness or badness. Then if I find out that my using, ChatGPT or my eating another chicken burger doesn't actually affect the amount of harm or suffering out there in the world, then on a consequentialist framework, it's not wrong for me to do so. On the other hand, you can have other ethical frameworks that say by participating in something, even though I didn't change the net amount of harm, I still am like endorsing the harm or something by using ChatGPT or eating a chicken. That's a problem. And that I'll just say, kind of your mileage may vary. For the purposes of this podcast, I think what we're hoping is to make it at least clearer to ourselves and those listening, like what are the kinds of considerations that might play. And so, yeah, just think about how this plays in. But I really appreciated your point about the water usage. Like, water usage is not all created equal. Energy usage is not all created equal. It's about how the costs and benefits line up, and companies can do that better or worse.
I would certainly argue that if you, for example, wanted to be a vegetarian, there is a certain amount of effort required in that, right? There's a certain amount of research that it takes to find out, were any animal products used in the making of this particular food, all that kind of stuff, right? I would argue that if all of the effort, this might get me in trouble, but if all of the effort that people use that were combined, that they used to decide whether a particular product they were about to consume contained some kind of animal product or not, if all of that effort was instead redirected toward applying pressure to political systems and economic systems, that would have far more impact on the world and far more impact on the eventual number of animals and the eventual number of tons of CO2 that was released into the atmosphere. I'm not a big believer that our individual choices, even when there are quite a few of us, add up to something that's really meaningful. And I think that to a large extent, the idea that we individually are all responsible for our consumption is a red herring that the governments and large industries have created in order to keep us from pushing for the kinds of regulation that would actually do something and instead make us spend a lot of time sorting our recycling into places where a lot of times that recycling is just going to end up getting dumped in the landfill anyway. Where if we spend as much time calling and yelling at our elected representatives as we did sorting plastic and paper into two different bins to get recycled, we would probably be farther ahead.
So if I was going to try summarize what you said, you are a communist who's against individual responsibility, and that's fine. You've made that clear.
You're certainly not the first person to say that. Although I would say the individual is responsible. It's just that your effort is far more effective when it's used for political pressure, when it's used for, social, applying, getting involved in politics, getting involved in community activity, being involved in community action, I think is a far more effective way of accomplishing whatever you would accomplish than by any kind of personal abstinence of any kind of product or service that you can choose not to be associated with. I think you're still responsible, and you should still be held responsible for how you do or you don't engage with your community and try to get things changed that you believe need to be changed. But I think that that's far more important than what you do or don't choose to consume in your personal life.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, and I'm sort of a both and guy there. Yeah, like there's individual and social level are both really important. One, just sort of bringing us back around to Brett on this one, right? I think this is I don't think it's in this original video, but in a follow-up video that he also talks about being a vegetarian and it comes up in similar kinds of contexts. Also sort of ironically here, by not using the thing, which, as I think you're right in stating, won't have as big of an effect, right, on reducing CO2 emissions, etc. But by making the video about not using it, 500,000 people are watching it and maybe thinking about it. So in a way that this may have been like the highest leverage thing that he could do to get people thinking about that. I put down 3 other types of AI harms here. I don't think we need to talk about them in any depth. I'll just list them. If you want to go into anything, that's fine. But you can think about the community impacts of AI, like putting a data center in this sort of neighborhood, which I think ties into the water stuff, noise pollution, those kinds of things. We have issues about supply chain, increases in costs going to AI technologies mean that my Xbox is more expensive and, other types of metals, those sorts of things. And then there might be an economic bubble here that is going to burst, and that can have all sorts of negative impacts as well if things don't go so well. And I presume your thought here, which is mine, is very much the same as the above points, that like those are all real potential harms or real existing harms, but those are not about AI per se. Those are about how Anthropic and OpenAI, et cetera, are actually carrying these things out. And we can rightly criticize those without needing to criticize AI as a technology.
Right. And the amount of effort that you put into deciding I'm not going to ever use a particular AI or not, I would argue is better spent pushing on your legislature to decide that we're not going to put data centers in the state. Because it takes far fewer people, theoretically at least, to call the legislature and say, you're not going to get reelected if you don't do something about these data centers. I think it would take far fewer people to make that in order for a difference to get made than people deciding they're not going to use AI.
Maybe add one more agent to do more of your workflow.
There you
so
go.
You can use that extra time to call up Kevin O'Leary personally and tell him to get the heck out of Utah or wherever he was going. All right. Next topic for where Brett thinks this sort of negatively impacts our AI usage, negatively impacts us. And that's the users themselves, the people who are doing the coding. And this I'm most interested in, in what you have to say, Carl, as a programmer. There are roughly 3 charges here. One is that programmers won't understand the code well enough because they'll be distanced from it because the AI is automatically doing more of the things. And because they lack this understanding, they just aren't going to be as good at their jobs as programmers.
So, I mean, in theory, yes. In practice, we've been down this road before, right? So the same
This is
argument,
what you're saying in the intro
right?
about
The same
okay.
the same argument was made back when package managers started happening. When you got to the point where instead of writing all of the code yourself, you could just say, okay, I'm just going to include the code that somebody else wrote for the networking library or the whatever library that already exists, and I'm just going to use that instead. And people were saying, okay, well, you don't understand that library that you just included. You don't know how it works. It's going to make you a worse programmer. To an extent, I guess that's the case. On the other hand, you are far, far more productive by being able to include other code that's already been written than if you had to write everything yourself. And the people that decided I'm only going to write the code myself and I'm never going to include code that was written by anybody else, those people, for the most part, are mostly gone from the industry. There are probably a handful of them. I know a couple that are working in very rare jobs in the guts of very complicated projects where it's really not relevant to pull into anybody else's code because the thing that you're working on is so specialized that there's no other code out there that would be useful for that. But there aren't that many jobs like that these days. And so a lot of the people who decided I'm never, ever, ever going to include anybody else's code in my project, most of those people aren't programmers anymore. And my guess is that some period of time from now, the people that say I'm never, ever, ever going to use AI for my code under any circumstances are not going to be employable anymore. That's not necessarily a great thing in terms of how the code is going to be understood or not. But I think that's probably going to happen. And I think that what we can do and what we ought to do is much the way we did with the package managers is say, okay, I'm going to understand the code at a different level. I'm going to dig into the code when I need to. I'm going to be aware of, I'm going to care about the bugs at the whole system level. When I find that something has gone wrong, I'm going to dig into where it is that thing went wrong, and I'm going to make sure that it gets fixed, whether that ends up being in my code or in code that the AI generated or code that I included from a library.
So you think I might not understand the trees as well, but understand the forest better? Is that a fair?
Well, it gives you more time to worry about the forest because you're not having to spend time looking at each individual tree. And so there are things at a higher, more abstract level that you can spend more time on because you're not having to spend so much time down in the guts of, exactly how this particular loop is doing this particular thing necessarily. Yeah. And that progression from, I have to worry about every single computer instruction, more or less, when I'm writing in assembler code, to, okay, I'm writing in C, which is more abstract. I don't have to worry about the assembler necessarily, but I'm still doing lots and lots of little things, leading to object-oriented programming, leading to, levels and levels of abstraction where we're looking at higher level concepts and higher level abstractions. And a lot of the stuff, people don't think about what the assembler code is doing anymore unless something goes wrong. And 99.999% of the time, that's fine. And every once in a while, you have to dig down there because there's a bug somewhere between you and the compiler and the actual code that's being generated. But for the most part, we're still productive and we don't worry about that anymore. And I think that's going to be the case over time as we as an industry figure out how to deal with AI generated code the way it took us a while to figure out how to deal with package manager generated code, or not generated code, but package manager included code. And now we have some best practices for that. And for the most part, everybody does it. And I think the same thing will end up being true with AI generated code.
Okay. So I like some of the things that I heard there in that it's, on the one hand, you don't have to leave necessarily if you can be hyper specialized, although that's rare. So we might not lose all of them. The other aspect is we might not be worse, or we might be worse at certain characteristics, but we might be better at others. And so there's this kind of trade-off. I guess if I really wanted to lean into the Brett style argument here, might be something like, yeah, we'll lose these people, or these people won't understand the code as well. And you're right, as a matter of fact, that happens. but like we're just worse off for it. Like we would still be better off if we had more people who understood the code more deeply, maybe weren't thinking as much about big picture things necessarily, but
the problem is if you do that, then sure, you have more people that have a better understanding of the actual code, but you have far, far, far less code. And you have a lot of problems, societal problems, business problems, whatever, that people could be applying code to try to alleviate and try to make better, except we're not, you don't have enough people available to generate that, to write the code to solve those kinds of problems or to work on those kinds of problems, because everybody's spending far more of their time at a much lower level of abstraction.
okay.
Right. And so a human programmer these days, actually, forget these days, a human programmer right before ChatGPT started, right, generated, I shouldn't say that word. A human programmer back before ChatGPT was a thing could write and debug and publish far more code and be far more productive and have far more of an impact on society and economics and all that kind of stuff than the same kind of person, the same programmer would have been able to do 10 years before. And 10 years before, they would have had a much better understanding of the internals of, or what the 2020 programmer would call the internals of something. The 2010 programmer would say, this is just programming. But the 2020 programmer can get far more done than the 2010 programmer. And we as a society are generating, I keep saying generating, we as a society are solving more and more problems. We're creating more and more code to work on different things. There are lots of businesses that existed right before ChatGPT in 2020 that didn't exist in 2010. A lot of things that people came to rely on, a lot of, mapping stuff, a lot of, GPS kinds of applications that, a lot of logistics stuff that didn't exist in 2010 were things that, not everybody, but, most people in the US at least were relying on a daily basis, even if they didn't realize it in 2020. And my guess is in 2030, the same kind of thing is going to be the case.
This has flavors of, as someone who's a fan of sports and the NBA in particularly, right? They talk about the previous eras, right? That's when they really prioritized real basketball, pounding it down in the post or whatever. But and while people romanticize that, often when you go back and watch some of those games from the early 90s, you're like, that was miserable. Like these people were so unskilled, all this sort of stuff. I wonder if programmers got in the room and were watching the whatever the equivalent is of like highlight film of John Havlicek or something like that. You look back there and you're like, oh, it's just they just spent 17 hours to write like 3 characters that did very little compared to the kind of stuff that I did today. We're all so much more sophisticated. I don't know, but there's something symmetrical there.
Yeah, there's a lot of romanticization. There's a lot of, back in my day kind of nostalgia kind of things. And I realize there are people that find that to be, entertaining or useful or important. I've been doing this for 35 years. And the people that are very insistent on, okay, this is the way I'm doing it, and I'm not going to adopt the new thing because I think the way I've been doing it before is better than the new thing. Those people tend not to have 35-year careers.
2 other things where he talks about having impacts on users. And I think I can guess your answer to these. These ones also I found kind of difficult because I could have placed these in other categories of his argument as well. One of them is that he says that programmers become more apathetic towards the code because they didn't write it themselves. And that in turn makes them worse at either understanding it or even caring to understand it. And this will tie into some of the existential stuff that we'll talk about later. And then the other point that he brings up is that because the AI is doing so much of the stuff, you aren't learning as much as developing it. Let me take a stab at what I think the Carl answers are. We'll see how well I get you. Okay, on the apathy side of things, this one I actually have less insight about what you're probably going to say. I mean, some of it might just be you know, suck it up. Like some things are more interesting, some things are less interesting. Some people might be less apathetic because they don't have to do as many implementations, and implementations make them apathetic. And like big picture architecture discussions are the things that get them really engaged. So it might just depend on the person on that front. And then the other piece, this is maybe something that I would say, like, that's kind of on PMs and management and people on the individual levels kind of figure out how to make things exciting if you can. And, your mileage may vary, but as much as we can, let's try and get excited about the stuff we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a case where there are people that got into programming because they liked the nuts and bolts down at the lower level. And I can see that. And there have been times in my career that I've been very excited about particular optimizations that I made in particular designs of things or particular, loops. And, I managed to save, 100 milliseconds every time I go through this loop, and I go through this loop, thousands of times a minute kind of thing. Those are the kinds of wins. Those are the kinds of cute little optimization problems that, in my experience, just don't stick around. And if you get really focused on, this is the one, really interesting kind of problem to me, you will get to the point where that problem is not really a problem anymore, because we as an industry move on and we figure out what the right answer for that particular problem is, and then we go and do something else. I have sympathy for people who are like, I found this thing I really, really like, and now nobody wants to hire me for that anymore. But I'm saying I'm not going to adopt the new coding tools because I like doing it the manual way is not a path for having a healthy or lengthy career. I have sympathy for people that don't want to change what they're doing, but this is not an industry that lends itself to people being able to do the same thing for years and years and years and years.
This is the Roy Hibbert problem, right? I'm just going to make only MBA references.
Then I'm going to be lost for a long time, but that's all right.
There we go. We're appealing to as broad an audience as we can. But big man in the MBA, his code word was verticality. He was huge. He could put his arms straight up. It wasn't counted as a foul when people went in. He didn't really stretch the floor, though. And as the NBA sort of moved on to where it was more, pacing and spacing, more shooting from the outside, and you had to be a switchable defender, and he couldn't do it, right? Sometimes you're just not there anymore, and, the industry passes you by, which doesn't mean we're like happy about that necessarily. Like you said, we can feel for that, but that's not, again, an argument against artificial intelligence per se. And then the last one here on whether you're learning or not, I think what you would say here is, given that there's a different focus of things that you get to spend more time on, you are learning. You might just not be learning the same thing. So there are different skills here. Focus on those ones.
Right.
Let's talk about business then. What are the impact? That was the impacts on the individual person, the coders, but how does it impact the business writ large? The first piece here, you actually have already talked about this a fair amount, which I thought was interesting. Brett brings up that we write so much code now, and having so much code is actually a bad thing.
Yes.
His contention is it's a bad thing because we get feature bloat. We're trying to do everything all the time instead of having more. So, yeah, trying to read between the lines a little bit for him here, but like when we have more limited resources, it requires us to be a little more creative and smart and intelligent with how we're using them. And that actually creates more streamlined and effective programs that are curated with care by humans rather than ones that just try and do everything and are just a mess.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a real problem that we as an industry don't have really good tools for dealing with large volumes of code changes. And that's because we've never had this kind of large volume of code changes before, and we've never had to come up with ideas for how to do that. I've seen some people talking about the way that they handle it. I have not seen anybody who yet has something that is here's a best practice I know is going to stick for a while. I know there are a lot of people who are using AI, using one AI to judge the code from another AI, I don't find that to be compelling. I don't find that to be particularly effective. There's an opportunity here for people to learn and people to create new skills and people to create value by figuring out processes by which we can do a better job of integrating this AI code. And that's an opportunity for people to get better at a thing that you didn't really need to be better at before because it wasn't really a thing before. And so it's a thing that we can start turning our attention to now to try to solve this problem, this new problem that's popped up. And that's part of where we can spend our time that we used to spend down at the lower levels of having to write a bunch of code manually. And I think that spending the time to learn how and to solve these, high volumes of AI code best practices issues is going to serve society better and serve the industry better over time than if we all stayed down where we used to be writing more code by hand and instead of letting the AI do it.
And here's some sneaky, for those of you who are listening to this podcast and stuck around this long, right? Here's some sneaky value. When you are worried about, we mentioned this earlier, economic problems that might result, a lot of worries about AI is, it's going to take all our jobs, et cetera, which interestingly is not even something that Brett talks about as much here. But one place you can look is, okay, we have this disruptive technology. What are the new frontiers of that? What problems is it going to allow us to focus on? How can I get ahead of that? I think there's at least 3 of them here that I can see that you're talking about. One is, how can we make tools or get people who are really good at code review so you can try and handle this sort of volume or come up with ways to manage it? Another piece on this feature bloat side of things is, how can we have, even product people or whatever that say, okay, even though we could use code to do a ton of things right now, how can we be really smart and selective about how to pare those down to only the things that matter, right? This is just more on that executive function kind of bit. And then the other front is just, given that we have so much more code that we can generate, and you referenced this a few minutes back, right? When you were talking about the good thing about generating lots of code is that there are a whole bunch of problems in society that we can direct code towards that we just didn't have the ability to before. Now we've got this fire hose that can produce a bunch of code. Hopefully we need to constrain that to make it good enough, but who can be the people that help us figure out what are new places that just wouldn't have had access to this before that can be really valuable.
Right. And the interesting thing there, when you say, hopefully we can find a way to constrain this so that it's good enough, that's an interesting problem, right? That, the people that come up with the idea for, how do we trim this fire hose? How do we figure out how best to apply the fire hose? And how do we figure out how to minimize the amount of leakage from the fire hose and the amount of problems that the fire hose causes? Those people can have a huge impact on the industry and a huge impact on what code can do for society. The people that are interested in moving on to those kinds of problems stand to really benefit from this, and the people that are very much in the mindset of, I'm gonna stick my flag in the way that I did things 5 years ago and say I'm not going to advance. My guess is that there aren't going to be that many people that are in that category that are still going to be in the industry in 5 or 10 years.
Okay, so there was us saying something a little positive about AI. We're now AI Zoomers, at least in that 45-second bit. The flip side, and I'm suspecting you will agree with Brett's sentiment here. I feel like I do, which is that a problem with AI in businesses is gone towards just being incentivized to be as productive as possible, where productivity is often measured in ways that are problematic, which is lines of code added, right, or something like that. Which is, he mentions this. I presume he's got data to back it up, and that'd be fine. It seems to pass the smell test to me. There's tripling your productivity does not triple your revenue, right? It might, who knows, it might even make revenue grow down. Like ultimately, a business should not just get too focused on using AI as much as possible. And that is one thing I think makes a lot of people upset with AI mandates.
Yeah, that deciding what you want the code to do has always been the most important part and the hardest part of writing code. What level you're doing that has changed. But understanding kind of, if you think of it in flowchart terms, understanding the flowchart of this happened, therefore I want the code to do this, this happened, therefore I want the code to do this, so on and so forth. Building that flowchart either on a whiteboard or in your head or in an outline or whatever, building that flowchart at whatever level of programming you're currently working on, that's the hard part. That's the part you have to get right in order for your code to be productive. And what's happening a lot these days is we're skipping that part. And we're not really thinking about what do we want the code to do under these circumstances. And we're not really thinking about under what circumstances is it relevant that we figure out what we want the code to do. We're just handing the high level problem off to the AI and saying, build this. And that's
we just
not
say
a recipe.
hack Hugging Face, and then it does it, and then yeah.
And that's not a recipe for code that users can depend on. It's not a recipe for code that doesn't, leak email addresses and credit card numbers on the internet. It's not a recipe for code that doesn't get hacked. So figuring out, now that we've got this new level of abstraction, how do we focus on making the decisions that are important, figuring out what those are, and not letting the AI make those decisions for us in ways that we're not even aware of. That's a really interesting problem that we're having to deal with as an industry right now.
The last thing that he points out that's a problem for businesses is that you're vulnerable if you don't have AI for a period of time. We have a workforce that it becomes more reliant on using it, and then let's say ChatGPT is out, or the tech bubble, AI bubble bursts or something like that, or chips become even more expensive, and now you've got to go back to old-fashioned coding or something. It's going to get harder and harder to do that because you're losing the talent base that is capable of doing those jobs.
So that's always the case, right? There was a point in time when we programmed without having an internet connection.
What?
Yes, I know. Believe it or not, somebody had to program all the stuff that made the internet go. And believe it or not, when we were programming the stuff that made the internet go, we didn't have the internet to use at the time, right? And it's very much the case now that there aren't very many programmers that can be productive if they're trying to write code in a case where they don't have any kind of internet connection at all, right? And there are times that in various places that I've worked, the internet has gone out because of, electricity problems, or because of, a backhoe cut through a cable, or a provider is having an outage, or, GitHub is down, or whatever. Yes, people are less productive at that point, but arguably, I think this is easy to argue, the amount of productivity that people have when those services are up greatly overwhelms the short periods of time when those services are down, and the amount of code they can't write during those periods of time. And I think that's, again, that's always been the case. The more tools that we have, the more vulnerable we are to not being able to work when those tools are down. Now, in the event that AI goes away, then, and I think AI is going to become much less of a factor when the bubble bursts, assuming that the bubble actually bursts. But when that happens, so if it were to happen that when the bubble bursts, if the bubble bursts, that there's just no way to use AI at all anymore, which seems vanishingly unlikely to me. But if that were the case, the same pressure that people have right now to start using AI as a programmer would become pressure to go back to, or not go back to, but to learn techniques for not using AI and hopefully learning techniques to be a better programmer and not using AI than would have existed before AI, right? So those pressures on changing the way that you program are always going to be there. There's always going to be something that's going to be pushing you to get better or different at your job. I'm not sure exactly how true this is for other professions. I believe, I would guess that for a lot of professions, that pressure is always going to be there to some extent. But for us in the technology industry, that pressure is constant and it's always there. And sometimes the direction changes. Sometimes you get pressure to do things a certain way. And then people realize, hey, turns out that library wasn't all that useful and it's lends itself to a bunch of problems. So now nobody wants to hire people that have that skill anymore. And we all need to learn this other thing. That's happened several times in the last 35 years. And in the event that AI goes away, there will be pressure to make everybody move in a different direction. And, people will.
And that's why you learn to program in Lisp, because it's the constant, and come hell or high water. Yeah. What you were saying there had me thinking too, what would it be like if total access to AI went away? But I can also just load up a small language model on my own local machine and these sorts of things, right? There are always ways that we can leverage some AI adjacent sorts of things, even if the public offering companies that are doing them right now immediately disappeared, right?
Kinda. So here's the problem. AI models are fixed in time, right? There's a point at which the AI model stopped training and it knows what was the state of its training data at the time that it stopped training, right? If for some reason new models stopped happening, OpenAI closed, Anthropic failed, Microsoft get out of the AI business, whatever. A year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, the models that are 3 years old that haven't had any new information added to their neural networks in the last 3 years are going to become less and less useful over time.
That makes sense.
I don't see that likely to happen, but the resources that it takes to train one of these new models on whatever the current set of training data is, the largest amount of training data that you can get, that's very different than the resources that it takes to use a model that someone else has already trained and packaged and released to you. So in the event that the entire industry went away and no one was making any new models, I would expect that before too long, the last models that were created before the industry went away would become less and less useful and people would stop depending on them for a lot of things. I don't see that happening, but I can imagine that would be the case. But I do not think it's the case that if everything were to stop right now, that we would still have the AI that we have and it would continue to still be useful forever.
That makes sense. Again, unless you're me and you only program in Lisp, in which case, the landscape's not changing as fast. So those old models will hold on. All right, last category for Brett, existential claims. And we've talked about some of these before with the apathy issue, but he was just sort of confronted with what's my purpose as a coder if these sorts of things are doing the things that I like the most? Are these the sorts of things that we signed up for? I think you gave already the compelling enough answers here, which are that things change. We have genuine compassion for people who thought they signed up for a particular thing, and then technology changes and that's not where they end up being. But that's also not a reason not to use AI as much as it is like an unfortunate, confluence of events where your interest led you to one place that the rug was pulled out from under you.
Yeah, and what I expect will happen is that the people that really like hand-rolling code will hopefully find places where that's relevant and necessary. So, for example, there were a lot of people that painted portraits for a living when the camera was invented. After that, there were still some rich people who really wanted to have their portraits actually painted like it was happening in the old days, right? And we still have, official presidential paintings that happen that roll out every term and, that kind of thing. But for the most part, there aren't a lot of portrait painters anymore, because now if you want a portrait of somebody, you get out a camera and you push the button and you're done. The people that liked to paint found other things to paint that you couldn't take a picture of, either because they didn't exist or because they were abstract. And there were big periods of time when most of the painting that happened, most of the paintings that sold, were paintings of things that you couldn't take a picture of, right? And my guess is that anytime there's a new technology that pops up that says, okay, a whole bunch of stuff that people used to do for a living don't need to be done anymore, especially in the kinds of cases where there's some amount of creativity or some amount of ability to change direction involved, that there will be people who are like, okay, cool. What kinds of things does that new technology not optimize for? And then how do I find a way to use my skills to go in a different direction so I'm not directly competing with this new technology? And it will be interesting to see what that turns out to be. I'm curious about what kinds of technology people are going to write code for that to handle. But I expect that to some extent that's going to still happen. I'm just not exactly sure what all the best economic uses of that are going to be.
You talking about the portraits had me thinking, there was something that was just on my mind the whole time I was watching Brett's video. And that was how the general tone of the argument is something like, I'm feeling estranged from my work, right? Like I had my hands on it and now I don't have my hands on it anymore. And when I think about someone saying that sort of stuff, growing up in the family that I grew up in, my dad's side especially, with like a bunch of people who are really good at carpentry, like working with their hands, touching, using lathes, using chisels, making a beautiful piece of furniture, right? And I find myself thinking like, there's some irony in being someone who works with a computer and feels like, oh, now I'm like too separated from my work. Like I just picture what my grandpa would have said about just about the amount of time I spend on a computer today. Like, when are you going to like actually get out there and do something? But I think this argument isn't even all that. The structure of this argument need not be all that AI specific, right?
Correct.
It can kind of apply to any of these sorts of things where you feel like you are in touch with something and then you become more estranged from it. And was that a good thing or not? How should we think about it? So just, I encourage the listeners, like, try and go through history here a little bit and think about new types of technologies, new sorts of inventions, which of those were for the better or for the worse. I don't think it's going to be univocally good or bad, right? That we have some new technologies. Some of them do estrange us from things in bad ways.
For some reason, recently, I've had a lot of videos in my feed. I probably watched a couple of them, and then the algorithm decided that I was interested in them. But I've seen a lot of videos lately about the transition from neon lights to LED lights, and how there aren't that many people that make old style tube neon kinds of things anymore, because it's a whole lot easier to do that with LED now. And there are people that are kind of bemoaning the fact, I shouldn't say that. That sounds more pejorative than I meant it. But there are people that are concerned because we've got this generation of craftsmen that know exactly how to do these really intricate, really, really pretty neon lights. And yet, the Vegas Strip, Hong Kong, these places that are known for having lots and lots of neon are all converting to LEDs because they're more energy efficient, and you can make them a lot more intricate and complicated, but we're losing this art form. And some of the people that I was watching interviews with, they currently are primarily working on neon for movies that are period pieces that have high budgets, and they're creating these lightscapes for period movies, or like this cyberpunk kind of retro futuristic aesthetic. And a lot of that is going toward the movie industry now. This way that the way that once upon a time there were lots and lots and lots of people that knew how to ride horses and knew how to train horses. And now, you know, you don't ride horses on a farm much anymore, or at least, my parents' farm. We have, little four-wheeler bike things that we use that do a lot better than horses, especially because they have a lot more traction than the bull. And when the bull puts their head down and tries to push against you, they don't win against the four-wheeler, which is really interesting. Sorry, that was a weird aside. But now the people that care about horses, some of them are in the movie industry and some of them are in the racetrack industry. And there aren't a lot of horse trainers or people that do horses, steeplechase stuff. But, there's not a lot of horse skilled labor anymore because we don't need that kind of thing anymore. And so people have found the niche parts of society where that still matters, and people have kind of migrated to that, but there are a lot fewer jobs and a lot fewer people doing that.
This whole thing, I like your point about, is this just the algorithm feeding it to us because we clicked on those videos or not, right? And that's always a concern. But I was thinking about, okay, this video from Brett has 500,000 views, right? Like, what explains the sort of cultural relevance that it's gotten? Maybe some of it is just a nostalgia. Maybe some of it is a general resistance to AI. You could even argue that some of it, we have some anti-capitalist, like populist sentiments, right, that are directed at AI and data centers and these sorts of things. And I think that can really, listening to Brett's description of, my boss tells me I have to use this technology that makes me feel estranged from my labor, and that sucks. And a lot of us can get on board with, that's a sucky sort of system.
Yeah, but part of it is there are a lot of programmers on the internet. And so there tends to be a lot of content that kind of finds us. And there are a lot of programmers. I know a lot. I'm sure there are a whole lot more than the ones that I know. But a fairly high percentage of the programmers that I know are having some, dread's not the right word, are having some kind of visceral reaction to the way that so much code is being generated that's not good code. And the way that, we really don't have processes to do a good job of narrowing down the AI generated code to the stuff that's good. And we really don't have a good way of finding the bugs that are in it and finding the problems that it generates. And, a lot of us are having to deal with, wow, this is not the kind of bug that I've ever had to fight before, because whoever would have written this code in the past that I would be debugging would have had some concept of what the hell they were thinking. Whereas this stuff is just kind of copy and pasting. So there's definitely some kind of reaction to that. It's very similar, from what I can tell, to the visceral disgust in a lot of the AI slop, whether that's social media posts or, weird pictures, or lately a lot of times it's been AI generated video that's popped up on, YouTube and TikTok and that kind of thing. And people are like, something about this just doesn't feel right. And then after a while, you've seen it enough, you're like, oh, okay, I can start recognizing AI slop when I see it now, and I hate it. And that backlash is real, and I think it's justified. And we are going to, to some extent, there were going to be ways that AI gets better enough that we don't have that kind of reaction to it. In some ways that people learn, okay, I can know when I see it and I can just click off of it, and then it stops being popular. And it stops getting views. And so hopefully people will stop generating so much of it. Although it's so easy to generate, I think we're probably always going to have that fire hose to some extent. Yeah. But there's certainly a big backlash to the amount of slop, be that video or pictures or social media posts or Kindle, ebooks or code that people are having to deal with these days. So I certainly can see videos like this resonating with a lot of people who are, even if they're not programmers, who are in the throes of wanting to figure out how to push back against all this slop that they feel like they're being drowned by.
And there's a part of it too. I mean, I've said this several times. One of the reasons I'm so happy to be doing this podcast with you is like, as someone who is not a programmer, I'm adjacent to lots of them. I talk to lots of them. But my views about AI, I just feel like I wish an expert would tell me how they really feel about it. And I think that that's something we get from Brett here too. We're like, oh, somebody from the inside who codes for a living and has used AI is telling us how they feel. That is extremely valuable. I think what you said actually summarizes really nicely how I feel. We started this episode with sort of, I was sympathetic to Brett's video, and not that you weren't sympathetic to lots of the content of the video, but more generally, like, given the historical context I have, like, AI is a tool, and you should be using the tool for the stuff that it's good at, right? I think the way that marries those together is, yes, it's a tool. Yes, it should be used for the things that it's good at, and we should separate out considerations that are like issues with the corporations that are making these and what AI is and can be as a tool, like in its ceiling. But then also, more broadly, it's fine, if not probably the right move right now, to be angry at the way that artificial intelligence is being used and foisted on us and giving us AI slop and all these things. And all of those things kind of tumbled around, I think, show up in Brett's video.
Absolutely. And I have sympathy for people who are, I spend a lot of time working on this skill, and that skill is becoming less relevant because of this new technology. I get that. I feel bad for those people the same way I can imagine feeling bad for portrait painters when cameras started being a thing. But I guess to some extent, I'm predisposed not to think that way, because the people that really dug into, I really, really love this skill and I don't want to move on to whatever the next skill is. If I thought that way, I wouldn't have been in this industry for 35 years. Right. So I got to the point where I'm always interested in looking for the next thing, because if I wasn't, I would have gotten out of this a long time ago. So I can see where he's coming from, and I felt that way myself at some point, but I've gotten to the point where I don't prioritize that anymore, because if I did, I wouldn't be able to make this a career.
I think there are some great lessons here. Hopefully, y'all in the audience have got some insights into like Brett's arguments, but also can just like generalize from this to other things that you're using. Like, this does not apply just to using AI at work. It could apply to using emails at work or using Teams chat at work or any of these things. Like, how do we do cost benefit analysis? Like, is this making me better? Is this helping the company? Like, is it worth it? And very much echo your sentiments that, like, being flexible and willing to learn the new thing, I think makes life and your work more interesting, as well as like makes you more marketable across things. But if people find that they are losing the skill that they found interesting and they've got no other skills, remember, you guys can always get into podcasting, because that requires no competence at all.
No skill at all.
All right.
We're going to keep running into people that have conversations or want to have conversations about how AI fits into their lives and how AI fits into society as a whole. It's always pretty much going to be a mixed bag. There's never, with new technology, there's never a thing that's universally better, and there's almost never a thing that's universally worse. So it's interesting, and I appreciate the opportunity to sit with you every week and have a conversation about how this is affecting us and kind of society as a whole.
Feelings mutual. Thanks so much, Carl.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.